In this video, we are going to update the Wingman FGC to the latest firmware version, and we're going to see if the input lag and stability has improved at all. For this test, I'm going to be using the Tournament Edition firmware, and that's because the release notes claims that the Tournament version has a 1.3 millisecond response time. Before getting into the numbers, after updating the firmware, I did notice an improvement when using it on the PS5. And to be completely transparent here, the software that I use to determine the input delay is on PC. Currently, there's no way for me to run this on the PS5. With that being said, if there's any improvements at all, I'm pretty sure we'll still be able to see it. Alright, let's get into it. One of the main reasons why I got this converter is so that I can play my Xbox Series controllers on the PS5. And we'll start there. Minimum input delay is pretty much the same here across the board. This is without a converter, with the converter, and this is with the converter and the firmware upgrade. Maximum input delay with the firmware upgrade is about 64 milliseconds. But when you compare that without a converter, you can see there's a huge difference here. And this is the problem with using converters in general, I believe. The range is just huge. It's nowhere near as consistent as using it without a converter. And this is due to the jitter. If you're using the controller natively, there's barely any jitter at all. And this is in milliseconds. This is with a converter, pre-firmware upgrade, you get about 8.5 milliseconds of jitters. That is just huge. It's a little bit better after the firmware upgrade, but the jitter is still pretty high. The firmware update improved the input delay just a little bit, and you can see it here in the polling rate at 92 Hz, whereas before it's at 88 Hz. There's a tiny bit of difference here, and you can see the same trend here with the Xbox Elite Series 2 controller. We get roughly about 10 Hz more after the firmware upgrade, and that results in a millisecond and a half of improved input delay. You can also see the improvement in the jitter as well. When I tested it on the core, it's the same thing. We get about a millisecond of improvement here. The polling rate is in the lower 90s now as opposed to the mid 80s. If you want to use the DualShock 4 on PS5 games, then you're going to need to use the converter. And let's see how it does. Before the firmware update, the average input delay is about 6 milliseconds. After the firmware upgrade, we save about 1 millisecond, as you can see here. Natively, without a converter, we have the polling rate of 258 Hz. And with the converter, you're going to lose about 100 Hz. But after the update, it bumps it up back to 197, which is a lot better, but it's still nowhere as fast as using it natively. It's the same story with the DualSense, 258 Hz natively, with the converter, 162. After the firmware update, it's just right below 200 Hz. A good way to think about it is, without a converter, you're getting just below 4 milliseconds of input delay. With the converter, you're getting about 6 milliseconds of input delay. After you update the firmware, you're going to gain about a millisecond back. In terms of jitter, same thing, essentially no jitter at all here, and we have about 4 milliseconds of jitter here. Think of jitter as instability, randomness that can happen. The higher the jitter, the less stable your controller is. If you've been watching my videos, you know that the DualSense Edge has crazy fast polling rate. It's over 1000 Hz, and that results in less than 1 millisecond of input delay. But with the converter, it goes up to around 6. After the firmware update, again we gain about 1 millisecond back, and the jitter is the same pre-firmware or after firmware update. On the PlayStation controller side of things, not much has changed aside from it being faster in terms of polling rate at just under 200 Hz. In terms of stability, it's a little bit better, just a tiny bit, and you can see here the gap is still huge. What this really means is, on average, for most of the time, you're gonna get about 5 milliseconds of input delay, but randomly, and this happened very often, you're gonna get 40 milliseconds of input delay, or close to 50 here. And as you know, 16.6 milliseconds is one frame in a 60 frames per second fighting game. If you have moves that require precise timing, even though you execute the move perfectly and on time, with the converter behaving like this, you're not going to be able to execute it consistently. As much as I would love for it to be instantaneous, it's just not possible, guys. And that translation process takes about 10 to 11 milliseconds for the PS5 to read Xbox controller information. And input delay by itself is only part of the story. The other part is how stable it is. How stable is the connection? These numbers are still pretty high compared to using them natively. And as you can see here, the range is still huge. If it's only a few milliseconds apart, we can deal with that. But in this sample, for example, there's 70 milliseconds of difference. To wrap it up, did they improve the input delay? Yes, by a little bit. Did they improve stability? Also yes, but by a very small margin. If you use this casually and there's nothing on the line, you'll be just fine. In fact, I love the fact that this thing exists at all. The fact that I can use my Xbox controllers on the PS5 is amazing. And hopefully one day the chips are fast enough to do this conversion process instantly. Unfortunately, we are not there yet. If you want to take this converter and use it in a tournament setting, I really don't recommend it. Alright, that's going to be it for me. Hopefully you found that to be helpful. Give the video a like, subscribe for more, and take care now.